The comments and views expressed on The Moore Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The Moore Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting from the UK and across the world online. You're now watching The Moore Show, and I'm your host, Kevin Moore. Now for the next hour, I'll be covering subjects that will open up your mind and provide you with information you may have never heard before. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined with my guest, Mike Sauve. Now Mike has written a number of non-fiction novels, with his latest book, Who Authored the John Titor Legend? Now he asked the questions of whether or not John Titor was a real time traveller, which remains the subject of debate. Now this book sets that question aside to examine several figures who may be responsible for the post and more. Mike Sauve, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Hey man, it's great to have you on, it really is. Now I've got so much John Titor information coming to me right now. I'm a bit overloaded with it all, to be honest with you. I'm so glad you've come on right now. I just had a previous John, Titor, he called himself, John Titor interview, which you know all about. And the guy that came on, was not John Titor. But what was really interesting about that story was that there are some golden nuggets still within that book, still within that story. So I kind of decided to keep that video online and keep it active, because I thought, well, if someone comes along, there's still some good bits in there, and if that could lead them to the original John Titor story, well, that's all the good.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've always found kind of galling about him is he doesn't even really have a firm grasp of the original John Titor story. And I believe I heard him on Coast to Coast, and he was even dismissive of the original John Titor, saying that he was the fake. So I kind of felt, where is this guy coming from to have the temerity to say this? And it just felt to me like he was sort of just co-opting the John Titor name for whatever purposes he has.
Yeah, because that original name has not been monetarized, really. The whole story was never monetarized, was it, really? I mean, it's in that respect.
No, that's the biggest mystery of the story, really, is if somebody did this for profit, obviously they've been very poor at monetizing it and have failed to do so, or it wasn't done for profit, it was done for some other mysterious reason, assuming John Titor isn't a real time traveler.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's been a few, haven't there? Other John Titors that have come forward to say they are the ones. The chap Dana that I had on my show, he wasn't the only one to come forward to say he was John Titor. No,
there's been several on Facebook, and they're generally pretty easily dismissed. They usually just by the level of their discourse. The thing that distinguishes the John Titor post is the level of intelligence, and a lot of these people are it's pretty apparent on first glance that they're just cranks, or they don't have that validity that the John Titor post has.
I mean, it's still interesting though, isn't it? I still find this whole John Titor thing fascinating. Now, just before we get it, I'm using the word John Titor. The only reason I'm saying those two different variations of the last name is because the chap that came on, who I've called out to be a fake, called himself John Titor. Your John is John Titor, is that right?
Well, I think it's just up to people's interpretation. It's actually a very uncommon name. If you try to look for John Titors or Titors in the United States, there's very few. So I guess phonetically, neither really makes sense. Phonetically, I think it would be John Titor, but I've always heard John Titor. Occasionally you hear John Titor, but I think it's just a matter of preference, really. So I go with John Titor.
Yeah, well, when I had Oliver Williams back on many moons ago, it was always John Titor. But and another thing as well, right? Even though I'm calling, this last interview I did with a self-proclaimed John Titor as fake, it's up to you guys to make your mind up as well. And if you can see some something good in the story, which I can find as well. There's golden nuggets within that story. That's all the better. No one's coming on here, or I'm not saying here that, this is my truth, so this is the only truth that you should listen to. You have to make up and discern your own truth.
Yeah, I guess for me, my interpretation is that I think every time that guy takes up a little bit of space in the John Titor discussion, it makes the conversation a little less interesting, because the posts themselves are such to use your word, like a golden nugget. They're a gold mine, because there's so much brilliant content in them. The idea of who had all this information if it wasn't a real time traveler, it's one of the great enduring mysteries. So every time John Titor 2 or John Titor 2 gets a little bit of space, it just takes a little bit of space away from the original story, which is, I feel, so superior to what he's peddling. And maybe if you're a newcomer to John Titor, you'll come and you'll hear John Titor 2 before you hear the original John Titor story, and then you'll say, oh, that's just a lot of baloney, and you won't, and then you'll end up missing out.
Okay, well, let's just get straight into it then. Firstly, your background, you've got a degree in journalism.
Yeah, so I went to Ryerson for journalism. I'd done a lot of freelance journalism over the years, mostly in entertainment writing, film reviews, things of that nature. I did some general assignment reporting at small local newspapers. And then around 2010, I started getting a little more serious about writing fiction. And in the last couple of years, I've had my first 2 fiction books published. I also recently got an agent, so that's kind of exciting. My fiction career is kind of on the upswing right now. But around this time last year, I was sort of piecing together all these disparate elements of not so much the John Titor story, but what came after the John Titor story. Who were some of these people that became involved only later, like Larry Haber and Joseph Matheny. And I started realizing how all of this information was spread out very, all across the internet. Some of it would be on a message board like Above Top Secret. Some of it would be, at the 12-minute mark of some YouTube video. So I thought, it might be a good service to the people that are into John Titor to kind of bring all this together in one place. So I started working on my first nonfiction book, and it just came out about a month ago or a few weeks ago.
Well, congratulations on that, really. I mean, that's it. That's that's a feat, that really is. And also, I mean, just for the audience who may not know, let's also just get into who John Titor was, and also what was your attraction to this story as well.
Okay, so I'll answer the first one first, or the second one first. I've always been into, many of the subjects you cover on your show and that are covered on similar shows, UFOs, pretty much all of it, Bigfoot, the whole spectrum. But the one that I was always particularly compelled by was time travel. And I can recall I'm sure you've been down these YouTube rabbit holes where you're just watching one increasingly weird video after another, really late at night. And I heard an old Coast to Coast episode hosted by George Noory talking about John Titor. And as I was listening to it, I started Googling John Titor, and I immediately got this sort of shiver of recognition, because I could see there was a lot more validity here than there is in a lot of these other stories in this realm. And I was looking at the technical drawing of his time machine, and I was realizing just how many posts there were. And as I began reading them, I said, oh, this isn't just some yahoo. This is somebody who really knew what he was talking about. So from there, I was always interested, and I continued to keep up with the story. Whenever there'd be a new development, I'd be the first one, or one of the first ones, to be discussing it with others on the internet. And so I've always been really into the John Titor story. And then, I'll try to break down the John Titor story, give you the capsule version. But the thing about it is it really branches off in a lot of directions. There's a lot of tributaries to the story. So, but in a nutshell, John claimed to be a man from the year 2036, and he was sent back in time to initially 1975 to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer. And what John claimed was that the IBM had a unique emulating capability to translate between Unix, APL, and BASIC. And one of the first pieces of validity that would come out only later is, I believe it was Oliver Williams. He contacted one of the engineers of this IBM 5100, and the engineer told Oliver, this is true, and there's only about 20 people in the world that would have known that. And that numbers come under criticism in some circles, but it's still pretty fascinating. So if John Titor wasn't a time traveler, he had access to that pretty privileged information. And that wasn't the only piece of privileged information he had access to, as we might get into later. But so there's all these little bits of credibility that sort of emerged from the John Titor time travel posts. And so from 1975, he comes back to the year 2000, and he begins interacting with people on these two message boards, the Time Travel Institute and Art Bell's Post-to-Post message board. And he would answer any questions people had. People would ask him high-level physics questions, and he would answer within minutes. And the answers were always very credible. So if, at the very least, this is a guy who has either a physics background or is doing a lot of reading on the side, he would also participate in IRC chats, and he could answer just as credibly in real time. And so people were very enthralled with him. They'd also ask him questions about the philosophy of time travel, and they'd ask him about what his world was like in 2036. And he weaved a very rich story where he discussed there was nuclear war in the U.S. in 2005, and there was civil war in the U.S. in 2005, and then there was a nuclear attack by Russia on the United States. So the world, the United States John Titor grew up in was sort of a post-apocalyptic world where people had to band together. He was in a militia group called the Fighting Diamondbacks. So in addition to having all this physics knowledge, he was also a very talented storyteller. And as a writer, that's probably one of the aspects of the story that appealed to me most. So as a result, some people feel John Titor isn't one man. John Titor's actually perhaps again, you always have to put the caveat out there, if he's not a time traveler. So if he's not a real time traveler, there's this idea that he's not one person, he's 5 people or 7 people. One of them is the physics guy, and one of them is the sci-fi writer, and one of them is the, just manages the whole thing. So there's a lot of different permutations of who might have been behind it and how.
But obviously, no one's ever been caught or or ever been proven. And as you've said previously, it's there's a lot of effort's gone into conceal this. It's someone's passion, isn't it? To really, in a sense, to want to do this if they are going to hoax it.
A passion project makes the most sense because, like I've said, there's been no real monetization. There's so Larry Haber is an entertainment lawyer who came forward claiming he represented John Titor's mother, Kay. And for a brief period, the posts of John Titor were published on Amazon under the title John Titor, A Time Traveler's Tale. But that book wasn't going to be making anyone millions of dollars. And Larry claims it was just the mother asked him to do this, he did it. So that was one really minor effort at monetization.
So he published that book. That was him that self-published that book.
He published that book at Kay Titor's request, according to him.
Because that book is going for stupid amounts of money on Amazon right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's because it's out of print, and it's when I checked, it was going for $890. Right. But ultimately, it's just the post. So you can find those posts online. There's a PDF on my website if you want to download it. So save your $890. Just go to my website. The PDF's there for free.
Now, okay. So Larry Haber, that's interesting. So John's family contacted Larry. And Larry was then involved in this enigma of the John Titor, not conspiracy, is it? But the story.
I call it a legend because I think that's maybe the best term for it. But so Kay Titor, who again, this is all according to Larry, so it's how much you want to trust Larry. I do tend to trust what Larry's saying, but he claims he's never met this Kay Titor. That he was contacted through another attorney friend of his as a go-between, and Larry's whole affect about this thing is that and you can check him out. He does a lot of legit work. He's done work for Walt Disney, and his claim is this is just one of my many clients, and it's probably the most interesting client. But it's not like Larry is some ambulance chaser staking his whole claim on this crazy John Titor thing. Larry just kind of acts a little bit bemused about it, if anything. And so he represents the story. He's been on shows like Coast to Coast and Fade to Black. There's one famous interview where he actually acts as a go-between between George Norrie and Kay. So George Norrie is asking a question. Larry then relays it to Kay, and then he relays the answer back to George Norrie. And so you have to just take his word for it that he really does represent this Kay Titor, who's supposed to be John Titor's mother.
That's
And
incredible.
again, just a caveat for your listeners is that John Titor is a pseudonym, so he was always clear about that. So there's no sense in going looking for a K. Titor because that wouldn't be a real name.
Oh, so John Titor was never his real name.
No, he was upfront about that from the get-go.
But he never released, obviously, who his real
No.
name was, and that was never
No.
not even just the first part of his real name. No.
No.
Okay, so the mother is still there. Where is John Titor now? That came back to the year 2000. Where did he disappear to?
Well, that gets pretty complicated, especially with some of the developments that happen after. So his claim when he left 2000 was that he was going back to 1998 briefly, and that he had to retrace his steps, as it were. He had to go for some reason to 98, then back to 75, and that was the only way he could get back to 2036. But some of the stuff that's come out in subsequent years, Larry Haber was instructed to post a YouTube video and also to post a graph or kind of like an Excel sheet on the John Titor Foundation website. And what the graph is his coordinates. So the basic concept illustrated in the YouTube letter is that these coordinates are needed for all these multiple Johns to realign themselves in a way so that they can get back to 2036. So in the years that followed the story, the idea has sort of developed that John Titor didn't safely make it back to 2036 and everything is fine. It's that there's all these multiple John Titors and things have gotten very complex. Now, if you want to look at the story as fiction, you could say this is just a necessary plot angle to keep driving the story forward. But if it is a necessary plot angle, it's a pretty intelligent one and it's a pretty compelling one.
So when we say multiple Johns, is that because I'm going to get these words wrong here because some of this science is a bit above me? The sort of is it the Mandela effect, or is that the many worlds theory?
Yeah, that's the many worlds interpretation. So John's concept of time travel. A lot of people, when they think of time travel, they think of the grandfather paradox. I go back in time. Actually, let's not even do the grandfather paradox because it's such a can of worms. Let's just say I go back in time. Kill Hitler, come back to our timeline, and World War II never happened. Well, that's not the way John interprets it. He doesn't interpret it as linear. He interprets it as when you travel in time, you're going to an alternate world line. So nothing is, and then when you come back to your timeline, nothing that you changed on that world line that you went to is going to be the same on yours because it's a different world line. So as a result, one of the things he said was that the purpose of the only real function of time travel is to retrieve items, hence the IBM 5100 computer, because nothing he changed in our world was going to be different on his when he got back. And so this is another bit of validity with the John Titor post. So at the time, if you read popular science today, people like Michio Kaku, Brian Greene, they theorize about the possibility of time travel, and it's always sort of within this model, the Everett Wheeler model, the many worlds interpretation, and people were just not talking about this as much in 2000. I mean, the Everett Wheeler model had been out for decades, but it wasn't as in the public consciousness like it is today. Nowadays, it's almost becoming borderline mainstream science. So John was way ahead of the curve in his model of how time travel would work.
So let me get this right. When he went back to his when he went back to 2036, would that have still been, even though he may have changed the past now so that the nuclear war did not happen, the Civil War definitely didn't happen in our timeline, obviously. Well, not in 2005.
It still would have happened on his.
It still would have happened on his, really. So
he can only change things for us. He could do things in our timeline that will, as time plays forward, be different for us. But he can't affect his own timeline. That's, like I said, the only reason he came back was to get that computer because it would have a purpose in 2036. He could use that. They required that physically to work with the legacy code, but nothing he changed would have had an impact on his life when he returned.
How do you feel about that theory that actually if you change something in the past now, it's you're not changing your future, you can't change your own destined future of the path line you came off. I mean, is that something for you to easily accept, that kind of theory?
Well, you know what? I think it's actually, and I'm not a science guy either, but I think if you do look into what, your Michio Kakus and your Brian Greenes are saying, it's more in line with what science is saying about how time travel could work. And one thing I think we've had this idea of time travel going back to H.G. Wells' The Time Traveler, that it is linear, like I described earlier. But that's just a model that somebody came up with. And so just because that's sort of the previous dogma that we had, it doesn't mean it's any more true than the newer model that John Titor and these popular science writers are suggesting.
Well, it's bloody I can see why you've done this book. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And we've barely got into it. And also, you know, I'm very much into consciousness, right? Spirituality. And I'm just thinking, as you're telling me that story, I'm thinking, well, that kind of just makes sense because, you know, he's gone back to where, you know, in his time, the destiny of his soul is still the same. He's not affected the destiny of other souls around him. It's still all intact. Do you know what I mean? Those souls that are in that war or in that timeline is exactly where they're supposed to be. And if he came back and just to change something in the past, it's almost, you know, taken away the rights of any other souls that wanted to have that experience here on planet Earth.
That's an interesting perspective. And there was one poster. Her name was Pamela Moore. She interacted with John more than anyone else. She actually talked with him on the phone. She had a lot of instant messenger chats with him. And in the post, she was more inclined to ask those spiritually oriented questions. And he wasn't quite as adept at answering those. I don't think that John was a military guy. John was, you know, he knew the science of his time machine, but he compared it to how a pilot might be able to describe the engine of his plane. He couldn't describe it like the engineer who built it. But that was sort of John's milieu, right? He was more of a,
right.
If you picture like a military pilot, he might not really be able to, you know, discuss the nature of the soul
I know, and even me trying to describe it there, I'm not doing it any justice whatsoever. But I think we're on the same level, in what I'm trying to say. That's interesting, and it has to be a Moore, doesn't it? Pamela Moore. My last name's Kevin Moore. But then so did Pamela Moore? Did she not really in the end believe the? Was she a bit more of a debunker then in the end?
The interesting thing about Pamela is that John Titor gave her what's called the secret song, and apparently it's a B-52 song, and that song would be used to validate or invalidate anyone who would later claim to be John Titor. And Pamela hasn't, so far, Pamela hasn't been given that song from anyone, including the John Titor Foundation that Larry represents. But she did come to believe, there's a piece of evidence that was found by... there's an internet sort of sleuth called Rasmus, or he's more often called the Hoax Hunter, and he found a piece of evidence that links a John Titor Foundation P.O. box to a P.O. box that was held by Larry Haber's brother many years previous. And a lot of people consider this the smoking gun because it shows foresight, I guess, that they had this P.O. box years in advance, and it was registered to John R. Haber, which was not actually his brother's name, but a name that is bandied about when John Titor, the authors of John Titor, end up getting discussed. So Pamela has come to believe that P.O. box is the smoking gun, and she thinks she's accepted the Hoax Hunter's findings, and so she no longer believes, essentially. And she's always been open-minded. She was never looking to debunk or looking to prove. She was just waiting to let the evidence speak for itself, and in her mind, that's conclusive enough evidence. So that's where,
well, that's
as of
interesting.
Now, that's where she's at.
Yeah, that's it. So his brother Richard, right? Okay. Yeah, see, Larry's an interesting guy. I mean, would you be surprised if there's any more John Titor information to come through, Larry, yet that's not been disclosed?
Well, there's supposed to be a departure video. That's John had mentioned that when he was leaving, that he was going to have his family film his time travel unit leaving, and so supposedly either Kay or Larry is in possession of this, and that's kind of like the big reveal that everyone's waiting on. I know in 2015. Larry was on Jimmy Church, and he said there'd be something big coming, but that hasn't come. So,
and have you spoken to Larry about that?
Yeah, Larry and I speak occasionally, and he's kind of what you'd expect. He's a lawyer. He's a busy man. He'll respond to me politely and briefly, but he doesn't. I did interview him for the book, but in general, he doesn't have a ton to say.
Do you believe him?
I tend to believe him only because he's definitely a credible professional in his field, and I can't really understand why he'd put himself out there representing a fake client like this. So there's actually a number of permutations that I consider. There's the idea that somebody wrote the story and then they hired Larry unknowingly to represent the story because he's never met this Kate Teeter. So you and I could be employing Larry Haber right now. He could not know who's employing him. There's the potential that Larry's brother, Richard Haber, who's often called John Rick Haber, that he wrote the story and that he's employing Larry. There's the potential that somebody like Joseph Matheny, who's came forward to take credit and who is actually who's criticized Larry, saying that Larry's a fraud and all these things. There's even the potential that he is hiring Larry and he just wants all these extra layers of removal to make it that much more fascinating. So there's a number of different ways to consider Larry's involvement. I do waffle back and forth between thinking, okay, he has to be involved in some way because he's the key player. He's the only person really pushing this story forward. But then I think, this guy just doesn't seem like, what's his stake in the game? It just doesn't really add up.
No, it does not at all. And it was an interesting future that, let's just go to the Civil War as well. Now, with the latest elections and all the changes that are taking place, I suppose that's the best word for it in the United States and the world right now. Had this had been a few years ago, and we could have known where the world was going right now, you could have said, maybe 10 years ago could have predicted that maybe there could have been a civil war. I mean, not that I would ever want that at all, and things have started calming down a little bit since the elections, right?
I think what's interesting about that is that going back and listening to a number of interviews and radio programs about John Titor, all since he made those posts in 2004 during the second Bush administration, people thought we were on the cusp of civil war. In 2008, when Obama was elected, people thought this is what John was talking about. So ever since he's posted that, people have thought, okay, this is a signpost to what John was saying. What is becoming increasingly in line with what John said was the idea of Russia being our primary enemy. Now, I always say there's sort of two aspects of the John Titor story. There's some of the predictions he made that required him to have rarefied information that makes it very impressive. And then there's other predictions that maybe a talented futurist or someone who knew the scope of history could make. So one of them could be, even though things were at real détente with Russia in 2000, 2001, right. No one was worried about a U.S.-Russian nuclear war at the time. Nope. The Cold War was well over. But it wouldn't take, someone who it wouldn't take an absolute soothsayer to say that those problems might not reemerge, right? But now it does seem to be like the Russian conflict is definitely heating up a little bit. And I have heard people say, well, what if John Titor predicted these civil wars and nuclear attacks to be occurring around 2004, 2005. I have heard people say, well, what if he just put it 10 years off to keep people kind of in the dark a little bit so that they weren't so he had this philosophy that he wouldn't provide people with certain information because it was against his ethics. He wouldn't give people specific names, stock tips. He wouldn't allow them to avoid death by probability. So he wouldn't say, you need to not be in this spot on this date because there's going to be an earthquake. So that would sort of open the door to saying, well, maybe John didn't want to give us an exact roadmap for the future. Maybe he wanted to offset it by those 10 years.
It's possible, isn't it? I mean, obviously he never mentioned anything about Trump getting into power or someone like Trump, even though, as far as I understand, some people have accused Trump of being John Titor as well.
So. Yeah, that's very amusing, actually. The Trump Titor, I think it originated on 4chan, and the sort of kernel of intrigue in it is that apparently Trump's uncle, John Trump, was at MIT when Tesla died, and he inherited some of Tesla's papers. So that's sort of the jumping off point for that whole. But then from there, it just gets kind of silly and funny. But it is rather amusing.
Well, if anything, I was going to save these kind of questions to the last, but just seeing as we're in the middle of it right now, and this is important, if anything, John's message is a warning, isn't it, of the potential of where we could go if we, don't take self-responsibility and don't, try to come from our problems in a better perspective, because these things are on our doorstep otherwise.
Yeah, he was very contemptuous of a lot of the people he was dealing with because, they were asking him questions about who was going to win a sporting event and things of this nature. And if you think that you've been through nuclear war, you've been through civil war, you've been in a militia, you've had a hard life, and you're seeing, you think back to 2000, 2001, there was a lot of stability in the world. It was a time of real affluence and comfort. So he was very angry with people for not being more aware of things like the Constitution, not being more aware of the food we put in our bodies. He talks about Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is like the human equivalent of mad cow disease. And apparently that was a real problem in his time. So for him, he wouldn't eat anything that he couldn't trace the origins of. And so he was horrified when he'd walk into a supermarket and just see all this stuff with God knows where it came from, God knows what some of the additives were in it. And the creepy thing about that the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is it actually has a very long incubation period. It's like over a decade. So there is the possibility that maybe there's a massive outbreak going on even right now, but we're not going to be aware of it for several more years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's surprising, isn't it, as well? Why did he go back to his own timeline? There must have been something pulling him there that was so strong to want to go back and, not just to want to boycott the mission either and just stay in the peace and tranquility of where he was and the safety of where he was compared to the timeline that he would have gone back to.
John actually prefers his world, and he actually talks about how the sort of tribulations that him and his family went through were necessary sort of cleansing, because he didn't really... He makes the compare. He talks about driving with his parents along the freeway and seeing someone whose car is broken down and they don't stop to help him. And John can't even fathom that, because the world he lives in has gone back to a sort of frontier mentality where people band together, community is very strong, and so he saw the sort of social isolationism and the type of crass ways that we entertain ourselves and keep ourselves, fat and happy. He was very actually resentful of those things. So he preferred living in his world.
Isn't that... Yeah. See, the thing with this story, there's lots of answers, isn't there? And that's a pretty good answer, I've got to say. Out of all answers to come up with, that is yeah. Okay, well, look, there's so much here in this. I bet when you was doing this, I bet you must have been, well, what do I keep in? What do I keep out? Because obviously the book can only be so large, can't? Well, it could have been bigger, but you don't want it too big, do you?
Right. Well, the focus I did was who might have authored the story. If there's a anonymous author, his name's Temporal Recon, and he wrote a book called Conviction of a Time Traveler, and it makes the argument that John Titor is real, and it's a very good book. I'd recommend it to everyone who's into John Titor. But I didn't feel the need to go back over that territory, so that allowed me to just focus in on who may have authored the story, and that really kind of localized it for me and made it manageable. Because otherwise, you're right, there's so much going on that it would be very intensive project.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I know we've mentioned off air as well that I interviewed Oliver Williams. Oliver Williams owns the domain name johntitor.com.
Yep.
So for people first getting into John Titor, they'll type that domain in and they'll come to his. Now I've not had him back on for a very long time, and I know you've been in contact with him. I'm pretty sure. Did you interview him for this book as well?
No, actually, I couldn't get in touch with him. I tried. I reached out to a number of people. I reached out to you even to get his email, and I did email the email I was given, but he never responded. So I haven't. The last we heard from Oliver was he went on. He called into Jimmy Church in 2015, but he's stepped back a little bit. I'm not hearing as much of him on the air. But I put him in the book because he's crucial to the John Titor story legacy in a number of ways, because he collected all the posts and put them on his website, and some of those posts in their original forums went on to become corrupted. So we really owe him for sort of curating those posts, because otherwise many of them may well be lost. And for many people who are into John Titor, they not only Oliver Williams isn't only the website the first thing they see, but probably he's the first maybe really credible voice they hear on the subject. They might hear your interview. They might hear when he's been on Coast to Coast. And one of the reasons I'm a little suspicious of him is his knowledge of the story is like beyond encyclopedic. Now, he may just be a very bright guy, but he knows the story inside and out. And if I wanted to get suspicious of Oliver, I would say there's a tendency of his to play up the strongest selling points of the story while not really focusing on some of the things that discredit the story as much, almost like the way an author of something might want to defend their work. But he's just, one puzzle piece of someone who might be involved. So if you do go back to what I said earlier about there being a consortium of 5 or more people, then it wouldn't shock me if Oliver Williams is one of those people. There's also some kind of fringish conspiracy theories that Oliver Williams had called into Coast to Coast under different names, pretending to be different time travelers over the year.
Yes.
I've heard the ones that they claim, unless he's very good at modulating his voice, I don't buy into those, but that is something that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I say, I interviewed Oliver a number of years ago, and I found it fascinating, the interview. Was his name really Oliver Williams? I don't know. But like you say, he really had studied and had a love for this story. And it was a shame that you couldn't contact him. But thank you for including him in the book as well. I think that's really important. With John as well, with the original faxes that were sent in as well, there were some references on those faxes to, for example, the missing skyscraper, for the Twin Towers.
Yeah, and those faxes are fascinating in a number of ways because they were written in 1998, so they came before John Titor was around in 2000. So in one way it fits because if you recall, I said earlier, John said he had to trace his steps back, and he was going back to 1998. So somebody wrote this story. That's a brilliant kind of out to put in for themselves, because why are these faxes there that sound just like the John Titor story? Okay, well, we need to cover our bases. Let's say he's going back to 1998. Or it really, there's always a chance he really was a time traveler. But, so those posts, like you said, it mentions a skyscraper that wasn't built in an area he talks about. So it's not quite like, a skyscraper was knocked down. It's not, like 100% correlated with 9/11. But just the words missing skyscraper are they do jump out at you. But some of the aspects in those faxes are just a little different than what John said in the posts. So if you get into someone like Joseph Matheny, who is one of the people who's claimed to have written the story, he says that was like the proto attempt, that they were just trying to figure out what they're going to do. So those 98 faxes, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret them.
Yeah. And I believe, was it not Art Bell that was the host of Coast to Coast when the original John Titor story was back in that year 2000? I'm sure it was. Was it?
Yeah, it was Art Bell, and he received those faxes were directed to Art Bell. And Art Bell also, I say in the book, assuming this is a work of fiction, it may never have existed if it weren't for Art Bell's program, because he was very into time travel. And one of the best things about Art Bell was if he would do open lines, unscreened open lines, just like Larry King used to do. And if he got someone that was interesting, he would let it breathe for, half an hour, a full hour. And so there were other famous time travelers that preceded John Titor. There was a guy who called himself Single 7. There was a guy who claimed he was a paleo egg tech from the year 2063, which is interesting because it's an inversion of 2036. But time travel was kind of a hot trope on Art Bell's Coast to Coast program. So one of the things that Matheny, this guy who's claimed to have written the story, says is that that's what they did. They recognized how neat this thing about time travel was on Art Bell, and some of them would call in from time to time. So they decided to do something really grand that they could kind of present in that sphere.
Now, when you look at the pictures that are on the JohnTitor.com website as well, with the laser pen and the actual, time travel displacement equipment. I don't know what you call it, but the box of tricks.
Temporal displacement unit.
Temporal displacement unit. That's it. Yeah. Yes.
It's made by Sony too. I always found that kind of amusing. It's like a Sony, and then there's a model number, and then the temporal displacement unit. So if you want to, if you're looking for something to invest in. It's General Electric, not Sony. General Electric. So if you're looking in a company to invest in that's still going to be around in 2036, according to John, General Electric's the way to go.
What do you think of the pictures?
Yeah, the pictures, the one, so there's the picture of the actual physical time machine, which no one has really been able to say what it is. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that a prop builder could have just put this thing together with some spare parts. What's a little more impressive is the technical drawing. So it's basically what you would see if you manufacture air conditioners, you have to provide a technical drawing that shows all the parts pulling out to show how it all interacts and works together. And these are complex works that take a long time. They take less time now that we have digital illustration tools, but in 2000 we didn't have those. So this would have required a draftsman to some people have estimated it would be a solid work week, a 40-hour work week to do something like this. So at the very least, if this is a hoax, somebody employed a draftsman or was a draftsman and spent all this time developing this very accurate looking technical drawing. And a lot of the science that goes into that technical drawing is the type of thing that people really weren't considering too much then. The idea of that it would be powered by two microsingularities and this idea of mini black holes. So recently in years past at CERN with the Large Hadron Collider, that's exactly what they've been doing, is trying to create mini black holes. And while the Large Hadron Collider had been built, I believe it was built in 95 or 96, it just wasn't something people were talking about. Now we hear about CERN all the time, but unless you were a pretty hardcore physics nerd, you weren't into CERN, and you weren't thinking about time travel in terms of being powered by mini black holes. So that's just another space where John was way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, well, and there's another one as well with almost describing YouTube as well.
Oh yeah, there's he describes someone asked John what entertainment was like in 2036, and he described it as being almost like plays. People get together in their own homes and they create things, and then it's just shot out over the internet, as opposed to the centralized entertainment that we had up until several years ago. But while we're getting into the accurate predictions, I do have a favorite one, and sure. It's a small detail. It's almost a silly detail, but it's the one that almost breaks his rule of just saying something that's confirmable. So somebody asked him what Project IT was, and at the time, Project Ginger was, and at the time there was this marketing campaign for this mysterious Project Ginger. It was going to be a tech product, but nobody knew what it was. And John said, within a very short period of time, it was under an hour, he said, it looks like some kind of motorized scooter. And what would emerge in later months is that Project Ginger was for the Segway. So somehow John had that information. And there's no real explanation unless John was, and this was kept under pretty tight wraps. Obviously the inventor knew, probably the marketing team, the design team, but it just, like the IBM 5100's unique capabilities, it wasn't something that was widely available. And what that actually gets into is another theory that some of the posters interacting with John may have been plants. So the reason John's able to answer that question is because they do have this information, so they set it up. They ask the question that they want to answer.
Oh gosh, right, okay. Well, there was others as well. What about the poem for the Soldier's Winter?
Yeah, Soldier's Winter is also one of my favorites. So somebody asked John if he remembered any poetry from his time, and he does respond. He says, he talks about this poem, A Soldier's Winter, and he says a few lines from it, and then he says, I only think I remember a few lines, and then he says people have added lines over the years, and then a few years later, in 2005, this poem, A Soldier's Winter by Larry Cluck, is posted on an online poetry site, and there's a few lines that are verbatim, and then there's a few lines that are just slightly off. And this makes pretty good sense, because if I asked you to recall a poem without Googling it, you might get a couple lines right, and you might get a couple lines wrong. So what makes this so the first thing you might think as a skeptic is, okay, well, two things could have happened. Someone involved in the John Titor story planted this story a few years later to add validity to the John Titor story, or someone who's a fan of the John Titor story used the lines that John Titor wrote in the Post as a jumping off point for his own poem. But the author of this poem, his name's Larry Cluck. He's a lifelong general, worked in the Department of Defense, and he'd been contacted, and he just had no idea who John Titor was. So this isn't some role player who's having a lark. It just seems like a very credible, austere man who doesn't seem like he would have done this. So it's fascinating, really.
It is. It really is. And, you've got this chapter in your book about, how would you basically identify a time traveler? And I've always thought that as well. I mean, how would you know?
Yeah, I guess you wouldn't know unless they told you, right? Or unless they were doing something that made it really obvious. But I remember the posts begin with John saying that he doesn't want people to believe him. Because if people believed him, the government would be taking a screwdriver to his machine and they'd have him locked up somewhere. So John was fine with not being believed. And in fact, this sort of gave him more leeway with people because they weren't trying so hard to debunk him, because he was willing to debunk himself, essentially just saying, look, don't believe me. I don't want you to.
What's your feeling? I mean, after doing this book now, which side are you on?
Yeah, I've been criticized by some people for sort of being on the fence or not committing. I think the goal with the book was really to accumulate all the information in one spot so that people could have it all ready. I did feel if I wrote the book, the balance of evidence was going to point in the direction of one person strong enough so that I could say concretely, this is who I believe is behind it. And I find myself now as uncertain as ever. I think there's a possibility. I still am open to the idea that he was a real time traveler. I'm open to the idea that Larry Haber is the front man for some consortium, whether unwittingly or not. I'm open to Joseph Matheny's claims to a certain degree, because Joseph Matheny does have the background to have possibly written this story. So there's kind of those four quadrants, essentially. Or there's the half, maybe John Titor's real, and then on the bottom half there's Larry Haber and Joseph Matheny. And I leave it to the reader to decide. I want them to evaluate the evidence and come to their own conclusions. What I do know is the Hoax Hunter, who we've mentioned earlier. Now, the Hoax Hunter, I give him credit because he's done a lot of research and he's done a lot of work.
Let me just stop you here. So is that the guy that's got his own YouTube channel as well?
He is, yeah.
Right, we're going to put that on the screen now. Yeah, okay. So it's just so we know what we're talking about. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so he's done a lot of great work, and sometimes people are critical of him because he can be a little bit brash, or maybe he'll act as though he's got all the answers. But he has done a lot of work, so I'd like to give him credit. And but he is claiming that he has the final bit of evidence, and he's going to release it on the last day of the year. So watch for that. New Year's Eve, there's supposed to be a truth bomb coming from Rasmus, and we'll see. Because some of the stuff he has come up with has been some of the better detective work in trying to debunk the story. Some less so, but if this revelation is what he claims it is, it will be something to watch for.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll put a link for his channel underneath this video as well. And under this video, I'm going to put a link to my previous interview with Oliver Williams as well on this story. You've done such a great job on this book. I mean, everyone just needs to know that we've barely touched the surface here. There are a number, there's quite a few chapters here in directions that I would... it just helps for you to make your own mind up. There's many different, there's ones from, that talks about the science behind some of it as well, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. There's one on a guy named Marlon Pohlman who actually tried to patent John Titor's time travel machine, and he basically lifted the schematics directly from the post. He was a Ph.D., so he knew what he was doing, and of course, we don't have mini black holes just available for any engineer to use right now. So the patent was theoretical until we actually developed this technology. But so yeah, that was sort of another aspect of the science having. I remember when that came out, people were like, "Wow, if someone can patent this, then it must be real." But the patent process, anyone can write a patent, right? It has to be approved, and then you actually have to have the means of creating what you're trying to patent. There's also a chapter that I think is a good one, pre-existing influences, and it talks about some of the things that were going on in the culture that might have been lifted from the authors of the story, and also some parallels between existing cultural artifacts. Like there's this book, Alas, Babylon, that's about a post-apocalyptic culture. And there's some similarities in the John Titor post. I believe he refers to the day of the nuclear attack as H-Day, and Alas, Babylon calls it N-Day. And they're both set in Florida, and they have a few parallels. So if you believe it's a story, then you can say, okay, well, maybe they drew upon this book a little bit. They drew on this source a little bit.
What do you think, for you, has been the most important learning or bit of information or something that's made you sit back and think, well, I'm better for doing this? You know, what has there been any sort of aha moments in this whole process for you?
That's a good question. I think on the one, just reading the materials that John provided alone is just a very satisfying story. It's like reading a good book in a way. So I think primarily, more than anything, I've been entertained. I've just thoroughly enjoyed it and found it entertaining because, you know, I don't play alternate reality games chiefly because they're not really fun if you know they're fake, for me anyways. But if this could be one of the great alternate reality games, and because we don't concretely know that it's not true, then we don't really necessarily have to feel like we're playing a fake game. We may be playing a game, but until we know that it's fake, then you get to feel like you're this detective on the cusp of breaking this crazy story. So it's been fun more than anything.
Yeah, I was just thinking of my question there as well, and I suppose as well, what is any sort of message to, you know, humanity that sort of John would have brought to us in that time that he shared with us?
Well, that's something that interests me because I feel whoever, assuming these were written by someone, they have a certain political leaning. They're very fond of the Constitution. They're very they don't like the idea of government overreach, and so maybe it was someone who's a sort of constitutionalist, maybe more on the libertarian end of the spectrum, and they're using these posts as sort of like a stump to get their views across. So in a way, and you know, people have said, well, if you're going to go on one of these, if you're going to go on these message boards that are into time travel, these are probably going to be people who are conspiracy theorists. They're probably not going to be huge. They're going to be open to ideas of big government being bad. So maybe it was just playing into what the audience was already thinking. But that's definitely a big aspect of the post, this idea that we should be very wary of the government. We should be self-sustaining. We should be able to, you know, in the event that the sort of social contract collapses, we should be able to protect ourselves and protect our family. So that was a big part of John's message.
Okay, well, that's very, very interesting. And for people to find out more information about yourself and to get the book, I believe that's all on your website, and your website is?
Yeah, www.mikesauve.com, SAUVE.
Excellent. Okay, well, that website, along with loads of other information, has been coming up on the screen throughout this interview as well. And I would just like to say, Mike Sauve, just thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
Well, we've come to an end on tonight's show. Don't forget that you can listen and watch all our past interviews on the More Show's official YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new daily shows. You may also find out more on all past and upcoming guests on the show by going to themoreshow.com, and do like us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates. So until next time, be safe.